Riffles are loaded with food. There's tons of bugs all over in these bad boys. That makes them one of the most important water types to fish because where there's bugs, there's gonna be trout, right? The two go hand in hand, like me and wings. You gotta have them. So what exactly is a riffle and why do so many fly anglers get excited when they get to fish them? Well, let's explain that. A riffle occurs, and I can get all sciencey on you here, but I forgot my bow tie, so you'll just have to take my word for it. But riffles occur when the gradient of the stream steepens up a tiny bit, and then there's a lot of smaller rocks and gravel on the stream bed. The combination of the gradient and the smaller rocks and gravel creates that telltale sign that we see on the surface that we call a riffle. So why exactly would a trout choose to hold in a riffle? The water's kind of moving a little quick, it's choppy. That doesn't look fish friendly like we've seen. We've been talking about seams and transitions and pockets. Well, they love riffles because it's a place that they can sit in the river and eat a steady diet of caddis tacos and not spend too much energy. There's 3 reasons that fish love riffles. Number 1, they get a steady supply of food. Because there's so much oxygen in a riffle, it kind of creates the perfect environment for aquatic insects. And since there's so much insect life in a riffle, the trout are going to park themselves there for easy pickings. If we've learned one thing about trout, it's that they want to expend the least amount of energy for the most amount of food. Yes, a riffle is moving faster than a pool, so the trout have to spend a little bit more energy to hang out there, but there's so much food that it makes it worth it for the fish. I also mentioned that riffles are great because of the high oxygen content in them. As the water warms up, as we get into summer and the fishing's great, the amount of dissolved oxygen in the slower moving water, it actually decreases. So fish move to the riffles not only because there's so many more bugs there, but because there's so much more oxygen as well, so they love to hang out there. And lastly, fish love riffles because they do offer a pretty good amount of protection from overhead predators. The choppy surface actually provides fish with a good amount of cover. It breaks the water up and breaks the light up just enough that your predators like ospreys and eagles and 10-year-old Spencer with his bow and arrow trying to spear fish, you know, it's harder for them to see the fish that are hanging out in the riffles. So now that we know why fish love to hang out in riffles, how do you go about fishing one of these things? I mean, there's no seam, there's no obvious place to cast. What do? Well, it's actually really simple. I've got 4 steps for you to help you break this riffle down into something that makes a whole lot of sense. Step number 1, just like any other water type, break it up into sections. Don't try and fish the whole thing at once. You ain't eating an elephant in one bite, and you sure as heck are not fishing a riffle in one cast. And that leads us into tip number 2, which is be thorough. Make sure you're covering the entire riffle. Cast to the stuff that's close to you first, progressively work out further and further, covering every bit of the water with your rig. I personally love to fish riffles with dry dropper rigs, but if it's a deeper riffle, you might need a nymph rig to get down to where the fish are hanging out. Your 3rd tip is going to be all about adjusting the depth. If you're drifting through the riffle with like a dry dropper, for example, and you're not getting any takers on your dry fly and nothing's touched your nymph, it might be that your nymph is not deep enough. So you'll want to lengthen that or add on a heavier fly, maybe a little bit of both, to get down to where the fish are hanging out. And like I alluded to earlier, you may end up needing to throw on a nymph rig to get down to where the fish are. Most riffles are fairly shallow though, which is why a dry dropper is a great rig to fish these things with. Just make sure that you adjust your depth so that you thoroughly cover all of the water that fish might be hanging out in. And finally, tip number 4, make sure you stay tight to your fly. Don't let a whole bunch of slack develop between you and your fly out there in the riffle. When a fish takes, if you've got a ton of slack in your line and you go to set the hook, the fish is probably going to get off. You're going to miss him because there was so much slack that you didn't get that hook tight to the fish when they took it. All right, that was a lot, but like always, let's take those 4 tips, what we just learned about riffles, put it into practice out on the water. So I just got out here to this riffle. It's actually kind of long. You can see it starts right up there and it comes all the way down here to me. And like we've talked about, I'm gonna break this riffle into sections. I'm not gonna try to fish all at once. I'm gonna work close to far, so I'm gonna work this stuff that's down here first, and then I'll continue working my way up the riffle. As far as how I'm gonna tackle this one, this riffle is not very deep. So I think a dry dropper is gonna cover it just fine. If I go through it and I don't catch anything, I might think about putting a nymph on, but I think a dry dropper is gonna take care of us here. I'll just make a few casts out here through the riffle, making sure that I keep my line nice and tight. Remember, your presentations do not have to be picture perfect out of the textbook. They don't need to pass the class here at the VFC Learning Center, right? First off, we don't have tests because we're not evil. But your fly doesn't have to be completely perfect in a riffle. Fish are a little bit more forgiving of less than perfect drifts, but you still want to keep a nice tight line to everything so that when the fish comes up to eat it, like that, you can set the hook right out of the gate. So that was awesome. We got a nice little brown trout right here at the end of the riffle. So I'll probably do another couple drifts through the end of this stuff and then just keep working my way up through the riffle. This is why it's important to always cover the whole riffle, because if I just made like one or two little drifts right there and moved up, I probably wouldn't have caught that fish. Probably would have not ever put the fly in front of him. So just like with any water type, you want to make sure that you're covering it as thoroughly as you possibly can, putting your flies in front of as many fish as possible. So one thing you can do in a riffle, if you're drifting it through and you're not getting any love on your dropper and they're not on the dry, one of the things that we talked about was the need to adjust your depth. So if you go through and you're not grabbing bottom at all and you're not getting into any fish, then it would probably be a good idea to adjust the length of your dropper or the weight of it. Maybe you just need a heavier fly on there, or you can add a little bit of split shot. I prefer to just go to a longer dropper or a heavier fly. Split shot's kind of a last resort for me. Remember, riffles are the food factory of the river, so there's a ton of food in here. So the fish are gonna move for food, they certainly will, but you don't wanna make them move further than they have to, especially if there's not a big hatch going on. So we've worked the bottom third of this riffle pretty well, so I'm gonna start making some casts into the upper middle part of this riffle here. The upper middle part, that's a very scientific term for you. I'm moving up, is what I'm doing. Just gonna drift this on through and see if there's any more little trout that wanna come out and say hello to the camera for us. Really, oh, he just ate the dry fly. That was fun. Right on the edge of the riffle too. Again, a good reason to make sure you're covering as much of it as possible. Hey, little dude. Two little brownies. They don't get terribly big in this river, but they get pretty and there's a lot of them. So what they lack in size, they make up for in numbers, like mosquitoes. Except for this year, because the mosquitoes are all the size of a horse, it feels like. All right. Drift through this again. I caught that last fish pretty close. He's right on the edge of the riffly water and a little bit of slower stuff. So I've got a little bit more water to work my way through. Again, just trying to drift through every part of the riffle that I can. Just missed one. He came up and splashed on it. And that was down here towards the end of it too. So again, oh, there's another one right there. Man, they're all over in here. Now, in the spirit of working close to far, I've kind of moved up and I've got a lot of water in front of me now. I've got Riffle here coming on the left. I got some dead water, more Riffle on the right. Alex, being my off-camera fish spotter, gear rigger, fly duster offer extraordinaire, saw a fish rising right here on this left Riffle. So we're gonna make a couple casts here because I'm close to it. And I think any more moving up might spook whatever fish are hanging out there. So if I can quit getting tangled and turning this into a clown show, I can make these casts. So we'll go right up here on the left. Better not include that cast. That was awful. Put that dry fly down. This is the moment of truth for Alex. Oh, that was a fish, and I just set the hook too late. So there were fish here, Alex. You're right.
You can't do everything, man.
Oh, might have been the one that he saw. Now I'm just working the bottom of this riffle first. You don't want to cast all the way up on top of fish that are in front of you, right? We've talked about that a lot. So just trying to work the stuff that's closest to me before I move up. Okay. And I'm actually going to come over here to the right and work this stuff. There's a fish right there. Took the dropper, another little guy. So you can see that I think that's three or four fish that I've actually touched, and another 2 or 3 that I've just missed. So you can see, and another fish right there. You can see why we love riffles so much, because there's just a ton of food in them and a ton of fish. Oh, little guy got off. But there's hardly a better proof of concept than a riffle like this. And not every riffle is going to be like this uber productive fish machine, but more often than not, you're going to get into quite a few fish in riffles. Just, it's their nature. It's what you should expect, and it's why we love riffles so much. So you probably won't find a lot of fish in riffles in the winter. In fact, it's very rare to find them in riffles in the winter, because riffles is not good winter habitat for trout. But it's great in the summer, because in the summer the bugs are out and about, and since there's so many bugs in riffles, the trout are going to follow them. In the winter though, the bug activity is significantly less, so the fish aren't going to be hanging out in the riffles because there's not as many bugs. So it's a great place to target fish in the summer and fall, right before bugs call it quits for the year. Oh, dang it, I thought that was a fish. Nope, just caught moss. I know my depth is okay because I've snagged bottom a couple of times, so I'm not worried about not getting deep enough for these fish. I just think this part of the riffle might be just a bit too shallow. Might not give them enough cover. They might not feel safe enough in it. That's one reason. Or maybe the other reason is they just didn't want to hang out here. Who knows? You try to think too much and figure fish out, and soon enough, you're ascribing them more intelligence than they actually have. It makes you feel good though when you get beat by them, because we don't want to be beat by an unintelligent creature. But at the end of the day, fish are just fish. They're instinctual. They react. There is no sentient thought. Oh, and there's our last fish right there. As I'm sitting here talking bad about them, he comes to me. Nice fish. Hopefully after watching that, you can understand why I love to fish riffles so much, and why every other fly angler loves them too. They're just stuffed with fish and bugs. I mean, what's not to love, right? You definitely want to stick around for the next video though, because we're going to teach you about how to hustle fish out of their money. We're talking about pools.